Good evening. It's December 14th, and there is something unfolding right now in the Russia-Ukraine war that we need to clearly understand. Not as just another negotiation snag, not as another stalled peace effort, but as a calculated move that reveals exactly why this war refuses to end. Vladimir Putin has placed a demand on the table that is not designed to succeed. It is designed to be rejected. Over the past 48 hours, senior figures inside the Kremlin have made one thing unmistakably clear. Russia insists that Russian police and internal security forces must remain permanently inside Ukraine's Donbas region under any future ceasefire or peace deal. Not temporarily, not as international peacekeepers, permanently. And according to Moscow, this condition is non-negotiable. At first glance, that might sound technical. It might sound bureaucratic. It might even seem like something diplomats could quietly sort out behind closed doors. But it is none of those things, because this single demand explains almost everything about why peace talks keep collapsing and why, despite the language of negotiations, Russia is not actually offering peace at all. Before we go any further, let me ask you for just a moment if this kind of clear, in-depth analysis is useful to you. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps, and I truly appreciate your support. What Russia is asking for is not security, it is control. And Ukraine understands that better than anyone. Tonight, I want to walk you through exactly why this demand is so dangerous, why Ukraine rejected it immediately, and why accepting it would not end the war, but would quietly erase Ukraine's sovereignty over time. We'll break this down step by step. First, what Donbas really is and why it matters so much. Then, what Russian police actually means in practice. Then, how history shows us exactly where this leads. And finally, what comes next and why the path forward remains so narrow. But before we continue, one quick reminder. If you find this kind of in-depth geopolitical analysis valuable, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely keeps this work going. Now let's begin with Donbas itself, because to understand this demand, you first have to understand the prize. To grasp why Putin's demand is so explosive, we need to slow down and talk about Donbas. Because Donbas is not just a battlefield on a map. It is not just a contested region mentioned in headlines. It is one of the central pillars of Ukraine's economy, identity, and strategic survival. Donbas is short for the Donetsk Basin, and it consists primarily of two regions in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. Before the war, more than 7 million people lived there. It was heavily industrialized, densely populated, and deeply integrated into Ukraine's national economy. This region powered Ukraine. Donbas produced the vast majority of the country's coal. It supported steel plants, chemical factories, heavy machinery manufacturing, and energy production. Entire supply chains across Ukraine depended on output from Donetsk and Luhansk. When people describe Donbas as valuable, they are not exaggerating. Losing it weakens Ukraine economically, militarily, and politically all at once. But Donbas also carries strategic importance beyond economics. It sits directly along Ukraine's eastern border with Russia. Control of Donbas means control of transportation corridors, rail lines, logistics routes, and military access points. It also creates a land bridge toward southern Ukraine and the Black Sea region. From Moscow's perspective, Donbas is not just land. It is leverage. Before 2014, despite political differences and linguistic diversity, Donbas was Ukrainian. Cities like Donetsk had universities, modern infrastructure, football stadiums, and ordinary civilian life. Russian was widely spoken, yes, but language did not equal loyalty to Moscow. That distinction matters because it is where much of the propaganda begins. Everything changed in 2014. After Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution and the collapse of the pro-Russian government in Kyiv, Russia moved quickly. Crimea was annexed. And in eastern Ukraine, armed groups backed, supplied, and directed by Moscow launched an uprising. The so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic were declared entities recognized by almost no one outside Russia. What followed was 8 years of low-intensity war. More than 14,000 people were killed between 2014 and 2022. Front lines hardened, Russian influence deepened. And Moscow learned something critical. Keeping a conflict unresolved gives Russia permanent leverage over Ukraine's future. Then came February 24, 2022. Russia launched its full-scale invasion, claiming it was acting to liberate Donbas and protect Russian-speaking populations. What followed was not protection, it was destruction. Cities were flattened, Infrastructure was wiped out, civilian life collapsed, and now, after nearly 4 years of war, Putin is returning to Donbas with a different framing. Not tanks, not offensives. That word is doing enormous work here, because when Russia says police, it is not talking about traffic enforcement or community safety. It is talking about control, surveillance, repression, and permanence. And that brings us to the core of this demand and why it has nothing to do with peace. When Vladimir Putin talks about keeping Russian police in Donbas, he is not talking about law enforcement in the normal sense. He is not talking about crime prevention or maintaining public order. He is talking about installing Russia's internal security system inside another sovereign state. That distinction matters because in the Russian system, police are inseparable from political power. They are the mechanism through which political control is enforced. Let's be precise about what this actually means. First, there is Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard. This is not a standard security force. It was created by Putin in 2016 and answers directly to him, bypassing the traditional military chain of command. Its mission is not external defense. Its mission is internal control. Rosgvardia suppresses protests, monitors civilian populations, enforces loyalty, and crushes dissent. It is the force used against Russian citizens when the Kremlin feels threatened. Placing Rosgvardia in Donbas would mean embedding Putin's personal security apparatus inside Ukraine. Second, there is the Ministry of Internal Affairs, known as the MVD. This includes investigative units, intelligence, linked policing, and population monitoring. In occupied territories, these units identify pro-Ukrainian civilians, dismantle local networks, and neutralize resistance before it becomes visible. Third, there is the FSB, Russia's primary security service and the successor to the KGB. Wherever Russian police structures operate in conflict zones, the FSB follows. Its role includes counterintelligence, interrogations, infiltration, and long-term surveillance. This is how occupied regions are pacified, not protected. So when Moscow says police, what it is really describing is a full-spectrum security occupation. This is why Ukraine's response was immediate and absolute. Because police power determines everything that comes next. It determines who can organize politically, who can run for office, which media outlets can operate, which language is taught in schools, and which history is allowed to be remembered. Police decide who is safe and who is not. And once that power is installed, it does not leave voluntarily. We have seen this pattern before. In Moldova's Transnistria region, Russian peacekeepers arrived in the early 1990s. They never left. 30 years later, Moldova still does not control that territory. In Georgia, Russian forces entered South Ossetia and Abkhazia under the pretext of protection. Those regions remain under Russian control today. In Crimea, Russian forces entered quietly in 2014 without insignia and without declarations of war. Local police were replaced, security structures rebuilt, a referendum followed, and annexation came next. This is not speculation, it is a documented sequence. First comes security presence, then administrative control, then political normalization, then permanence. Putin's demand fits this model perfectly. By insisting that Russian police remain permanently in Donbas, Moscow is not seeking stability. It is seeking the legal foundation to dismantle Ukrainian sovereignty from the inside without firing another shot. And that is precisely why Ukraine understands this demand as existential. Because even if fighting stopped tomorrow, even if front lines froze, even if diplomats signed a ceasefire, Russian police inside Donbas would mean the war had simply changed form. Instead of tanks, there would be surveillance. Instead of artillery, arrests. Instead of open occupation, quiet control. This is also why Russia rejects alternatives. United Nations peacekeepers would not answer to Moscow. European monitoring missions would not enforce Russian laws. A demilitarized zone would remove Russia's ability to shape daily life. Only Russian police guarantee Russian outcomes. And that brings us to Ukraine's response. Not emotionally, but strategically. Because when Ukraine says no, it is not rejecting peace, it is rejecting disappearance. Ukraine's response was immediate, clear, and unusually unified. There was no hesitation and no ambiguity. The answer was no, not a conditional no, not a no pending further talks. A firm rejection that crossed political lines. From Kyiv's perspective, allowing Russian police to remain permanently on Ukrainian territory would mean accepting the loss of sovereignty without formally surrendering land. It would be a slow dismantling of state authority that no ceasefire could undo. That is why Ukrainian officials treated this as an existential threat, not a technical security issue. President Volodymyr Zelensky made this position explicit publicly and privately. He told allies that any agreement allowing Russian internal security forces inside Ukraine would make future independence meaningless. Borders on paper would not matter if control on the ground belonged to Moscow. This position is widely shared. In parliament, among opposition parties, among military leaders, and among the public, there is broad agreement. Even Ukrainians who favor negotiations, even those exhausted by war, even those open to territorial compromises under certain conditions, draw the line at Russian police, because they know what follows. Russian police do not operate neutrally. They do not preserve local autonomy. They do not create space for reconciliation. They identify enemies, suppress dissent, and reshape society to fit Moscow's political requirements. Ukraine has already seen this in occupied territories since 2014. Local officials disappear. Journalists are silenced. Teachers are replaced. History textbooks are rewritten. Elections become rituals rather than expressions of will. This is not theoretical. It is documented reality in Crimea and occupied Donbas. There is also the legal dimension. Ukraine argues that this demand violates basic principles of international law. The UN Charter prohibits the permanent presence of foreign security forces inside a sovereign state without consent. The Geneva Conventions regulate occupation but do not legitimize it. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994 explicitly guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons. Accepting Russian police would declare those guarantees meaningless, and beneath all of this lies a deeper fear. If Ukraine accepts this demand, it sets a precedent for the entire international system. It would signal that a powerful state can invade a neighbor, impose a security presence, and negotiate that presence into permanence. That is not compromise. That is coercion rewarded. This is why Ukraine has proposed alternatives. International peacekeeping missions under the UN coalitions of neutral states, demilitarized zones monitored by international observers, long transition periods with international oversight. What Ukraine has not done is agree to a solution where Russia polices Ukraine, because from Kyiv's perspective, that is not peacekeeping, it is occupation by another name. This stance has consequences. It frustrates allies seeking a quick end. It complicates diplomacy. It prolongs uncertainty. But Ukrainian leaders believe that crossing this line would not end the war. It would guarantee the next one. And this position is shaped by history. To understand why Ukraine treats this demand as non-negotiable, we have to step back, because what Russia is proposing in Donbas is not new. It follows a familiar pattern. Whenever Moscow wants long-term control without formal conquest, the language is reassuring, the framing is temporary, and the outcome is permanent. In 1939, the Soviet Union told Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania it needed to station troops for mutual security. Within a year, those troops were everywhere. Governments were replaced. Elections were staged. Annexation followed. What was temporary became 50 years of occupation. In Hungary in 1956, Soviet troops entered under the banner of restoring order. They stayed for 35 years. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, the same pattern repeated. In Afghanistan in 1979, a so-called stabilization mission became a decade-long war. Each time, sovereignty disappeared quietly. In the modern era, Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Crimea all followed the same sequence: security first, administration second, legitimization third, permanence last. So when Ukrainian officials hear Russian police, they are not imagining benign law enforcement. They see the opening move of a familiar sequence. Temporary becomes permanent simply by waiting. This historical memory shapes everything: public opinion, military planning, diplomacy. Ukraine is not rejecting this demand out of stubbornness. It is rejecting it because it knows how this story ends. And this brings us to Europe, because while Ukraine's line is firm, Europe's response is divided. On paper, Europe supports Ukrainian sovereignty. In public, there is unity. But behind closed doors, the picture is more complicated. Eastern European countries see Russia through lived experience. Poland, the Baltic states, and the Czech Republic recognize the pattern immediately. For them, this demand is a warning. Stop Russia now, or face it later at your own borders. Western Europe is more conflicted. Germany, France, and Italy face domestic pressure to end the war. Energy costs bite, voter fatigue grows. Leaders balance long-term security against short-term economic pain. Germany struggles with the consequences of severed energy ties. France emphasizes dialogue. Though results remain limited, the United Kingdom has taken a firmer stance, rejecting any arrangement that legitimizes Russian control. For London, this war is about the survival of a rules-based order. The result is a Europe united on principles but divided on strategy, and that division gives Moscow room to maneuver. Russia does not need to convince everyone. It only needs to exhaust enough partners to weaken Ukraine's position over time. Which brings us to economics, because this war is also about money, resources, and survival. Donbas's value: coal, steel, manufacturing, transport. For Ukraine, it is the backbone of recovery. For Russia, it is leverage under sanctions pressure. Despite claims of resilience, Russia's economy is under strain. Energy revenues are down. Discounts on crude have widened. Infrastructure attacks disrupt refining. War costs rise daily. Mobilization drains labor. Skilled workers leave. Russia needs the war to end, but on terms that lock in leverage. Controlling Donbas through security forces is cheaper than continued war. For Ukraine, it is economic poison. No investment flows under foreign policing. No recovery is possible under compromised sovereignty. Transnistria, occupied Georgian regions, and Crimea are cautionary tales. Russia knows this, which is why the demand is framed as security, reasonable language, irreversible outcomes. But the economic math is worsening. Sanctions tighten. Costs rise. Pressure grows. Russia needs a structural win. Ukraine sees this and chooses endurance over a deal that undermines its future. So where does this leave us? Russia has made a demand Ukraine cannot accept. Ukraine has drawn a line it cannot cross. Europe is divided in tone, and the war continues not because diplomacy failed, but because it is being used as another battlefield. There are four paths forward: a frozen conflict, escalation, Ukrainian leverage through endurance, or a genuine negotiated settlement with real guarantees. The last remains the least likely. Putin's demand for permanent Russian police in Donbas is not a peace proposal. It is a test of Ukraine's resolve, of Europe's unity, of whether control disguised as security will be accepted. Ukraine has answered no. That answer carries consequences. But it also carries meaning, because sometimes rejecting a bad peace is the only way to preserve the chance of a real one. This war did not begin because diplomacy failed. It began because power was abused, and it will not end until the cost of that abuse outweighs its benefits. We'll be watching closely, because what happens in Donbas is not just about Ukraine. It's about whether force still decides the future or whether limits still exist. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and share. See you next time. Good night.